The artificial gravity hummed beneath Staff Sergeant's boots as he walked through the sterile corridors of station's residential wing. The metal walls reflected the pale blue emergency lighting that had become permanent since the main power grid took damage during the last raid. 3 months into his recovery leave, still felt the phantom ache in his left shoulder, where the plasma bolt had nearly taken his arm off during the Battle of Rigel Prime. He wasn't supposed to be walking these corridors at all. Medical had confined him to quarters until the nerve grafts fully integrated, but sleep brought dreams of burning ships and screaming civilians. The station's medical bay had done wonders with the physical wounds, but they couldn't replace the memories or silence the guilt that gnawed at him every time he closed his eyes. The sound of children's voices drew him toward a section of the station he'd never explored before. Following the noise, he found himself standing before a reinforced viewport that looked into what appeared to be a makeshift classroom. Inside, 24 children of various alien species sat in a rough circle on cushions scattered across the floor. Their ages seemed to range from what humans might consider 6 to 12 years old, though with different species, it was difficult to be certain. At the center of the circle sat a tall, willowy figure that recognized as a female. Her pale blue skin held an almost translucent quality, and her large, dark eyes reflected a weariness that seemed far too heavy for someone who couldn't be more than 30 standard years old. She wore the simple gray uniform that marked her as station personnel, but the way she moved and spoke suggested someone accustomed to caring for others. "Tell us about the gift giver again," pleaded a small child, his reptilian features bright with curiosity. His scales shifted from brown to green as his emotions changed, a sure sign of excitement among his people. The woman, whom could see wore a name tag reading Lyra, smiled gently but shook her head. "We've talked about this. Different cultures have different stories, but you must understand that they are just stories. The human concept of is a pleasant tale, but it's not real. No magical being travels across space delivering gifts to children. A human girl, perhaps 8 years old, with tangled brown hair and eyes that held too much knowledge for her age, crossed her arms defiantly. That's what adults always say when something good might happen. It's not real, don't get your hopes up. Her voice carried a bitterness that made's chest tight. But maybe that's because adults stopped believing in anything good. Lyra said gently. I understand your frustration, but it's important to prepare for reality. The universe can be harsh, and false hope can be more painful than having no hope at all, interrupted a young whose bronze scales had taken on a dull gray tinge that knew indicated sadness among their species. My parents told me stories before the raids came. Stories about heroes who saved people, about magic that made impossible things happen. But heroes didn't come when they burned our colony. Magic didn't save anyone. The room fell silent except for the ever-present hum of the station's life support systems. Could see the way Lyra's shoulders sagged slightly. The weight of trying to care for 24 orphaned children from across the galaxy clearly wearing on her. These weren't just orphans from human worlds. The hegemony's expansion had torn families apart across a dozen different species and star systems. I know it hurts, Lyra said softly, her voice carrying the musical quality that made speech so distinctive. I lost my family too when the hegemony attacked Prime. But we survive by facing truth, not by clinging to fantasies. We take care of each other because that's what real people do, not because we're waiting for some magical being to solve our problems. He found himself leaning closer to the viewport, something stirring in his chest that he hadn't felt since before Rigel Prime. These children had lost everything: families, homes, entire worlds in some cases. They'd ended up here on station, a military outpost on the edge of human space that served as for refugees and wounded soldiers. It wasn't exactly the kind of place where childhood dreams flourished. A small Avalon child, her crystalline features catching the light in a way that reminded of fresh snow, raised her hand tentatively. Miss Lyra, what if the stories aren't about magic? What if they're about people choosing to do magical things? Lyra paused, clearly trying to find the right words. That's a beautiful thought, but even good people have limits. We're all refugees here, barely managing to survive ourselves. There are no spare resources for luxuries like gifts or celebrations. The war has stretched everyone thin. So isn't real because people don't have enough? Asked the human girl. Or because people don't care enough? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and felt something shift inside him. He thought about the cargo holds full of supplies that arrived weekly, most of it destined for the military wings. He thought about the warehouse sections that held equipment and materials waiting to be redistributed to various human colonies. He thought about his own military pay accumulating in accounts he never touched because there was nothing on a military station worth buying. But mostly, he thought about the look in that little human girl's eyes when she'd said that adults had stopped believing in anything good. She wasn't wrong. The war had ground down so many people, turned them practical and hard and focused on simple survival. When was the last time any of them had thought about wonder, about joy, about making impossible things happen just because they should? As he watched, one of the younger children, a boy whose scales had turned a deep blue with sadness, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I miss the feast days on," he whispered. "Mama used to make sweet cakes and Papa would tell stories about the star-bringers who carried light across the darkness. Those were beautiful traditions," Lyra acknowledged. "And maybe someday, when the war ends and we find new homes, we can celebrate again. But right now we survive, finished. Always just survive, never live." She stood up abruptly, her small fists clenched at her sides. "I hate surviving. I hate being practical. I hate that all the good things are not real just because they're hard." She stormed toward the door and quickly stepped back from the viewport, not wanting to be caught eavesdropping. But as the door slid open and the little girl rushed past him, he heard her mutter under her breath, "If isn't real, then maybe somebody needs to make him real." The words hit like a plasma bolt to the chest. He stood in the empty corridor for a long moment, listening to the fatting voices from the makeshift classroom as Lyra tried to comfort the remaining children. His shoulder ached, his head throbbed, and every rational part of his mind told him to return to his quarters and focus on his own recovery. Instead, he found himself walking toward the station's main computer terminal, his mind already working through logistics that would have made his drill sergeants proud. Station might be a military outpost on the edge of space, but it was also a hub of activity with ships coming and going, supplies being transferred, and personnel from across human space passing through. If someone wanted to make real, really, truly real, they would need resources, contacts, and the kind of stubborn determination that the human military had been drilling into its soldiers for centuries. They smiled for the first time in months. His recovery leave wasn't scheduled to end for another 6 weeks. That should be plenty of time to organize a proper Christmas miracle. The first challenge would be understanding what Christmas actually meant to children from a dozen different species and cultures. Made his way to the station's database terminals, his fingers moving across the holographic interface as he began researching holiday traditions from across known space. What he found surprised him. Nearly every sentient species had some tradition of celebrating light in darkness, of gift-giving during difficult times, of gathering together to share hope when the universe seemed hostile. The Starbringer Festival, the flame season when they honored ancestors who had passed on warmth to the next generation. The Avalon crystal singing celebrations where communities came together to create something beautiful from ordinary materials. The more he read, the more realized that wasn't just a human invention. He was an echo of something deeper, something that resonated across species and cultures. The idea that someone, somewhere, cared enough to make good things happen for others without asking for anything in return. The problem was making it real. These children had been through trauma that would break most adults. They'd learned not to trust in promises of good things coming. Any attempt to bring them Christmas would have to be absolutely, undeniably, impossibly real. Pulled up the station's duty rosters, supply manifests, and personnel files. As a staff sergeant with commendation ratings, he had access to more systems than most civilians realized. His eyes scanned through lists of arriving and departing ships, crew rotations, and cargo transfers. Slowly, an idea began to form. 3 hours later, he found himself standing in front of Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez's office, holding a formal request that would either get him court-martialed or make him the most effective Christmas miracle in galactic history. "You want to do what?" Colonel Martinez stared at the digital tablet had handed her, her eyebrows climbing toward her hairline. "Organize a Christmas celebration for the refugee children in Residential Wing 7, repeated calmly. "Using available resources and volunteer personnel during off-duty hours." Are you sure the medical bay cleared you for duty?" Because this sounds like the kind of idea someone comes up with when they're still on pain medication. Couldn't help but smile. "My head's clear, Colonel. clearer than it's been since Rigel Prime, actually. I've done the research, run the numbers, and developed a preliminary action plan. It's ambitious, but it's doable. Martinez leaned back in her chair, studying him with the sharp eyes that had made her one of the youngest colonels in the fleet. Walk me through it. The children in Residential 7 are refugees from 12 different species and 15 different worlds, began, his voice taking on the crisp tone he'd learned for mission briefings. They've all experienced trauma, loss, and displacement. Their caretaker, Lyra, is doing an admirable job with limited resources, but morale is critically low. I'm not running a morale operation, Sergeant. I'm running a military station in the middle of a war zone. Yes, ma'am, but consider the secondary effects. Low morale among the refugee population creates tension throughout the civilian wings. Higher stress levels among station personnel who have to deal with behavioral problems from traumatized children. Decreased efficiency in all sectors. Paused, choosing his words carefully. Plus, ma'am, these children represent the future of a dozen allied species. How we treat them now will determine how they view humanity for the rest of their lives. Martinez was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against her desk. What exactly are you proposing? A coordinated operation to create a Christmas celebration that incorporates elements from all major galactic traditions. We use incoming supply shipments, coordinate with departing vessels for gift procurement, and organize volunteer personnel to create what appears to be a miracle, but is actually just really, really good logistics. And you think this will work because I thought about the little human girl's words, about the way the other children's faces had fallen when they'd been told not to hope for anything good. Because somebody needs to prove that good things can still happen, even in the middle of a war. Because those children deserve to know that they matter enough for someone to move mountains for them. And because he paused, feeling the words catch in his throat. Because maybe the rest of us need to remember what we're fighting for. Colonel Martinez studied the tablet again, scrolling through detailed plans. You realize that if this goes wrong, if children get hurt, or if this interferes with station operations, it comes down on both of us. Yes, ma'am, I'll take full responsibility. And you understand that I can't authorize the use of official military resources for what amounts to a Christmas party. I understand, ma'am. Everything would have to be done through proper channels, using only resources that are already allocated or approved for civilian welfare. Martinez was quiet for another long moment. Then, almost despite herself, she smiled. You know what? I haven't seen this kind of initiative from any of my staff since this war started. Everyone's so focused on surviving the next battle that they've forgotten there's supposed to be something beyond just survival. She looked up at him, her expression serious but not unkind. You have my unofficial permission to pursue this project during your recovery leave. But, yes, ma'am. It better be the most spectacular Christmas those children have ever seen. Because if you're going to do something impossible, you might as well do it right. As left the colonel's office, he felt a lightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the station's artificial gravity. For the first time in months, he had a mission that wasn't about destroying something or preventing someone from being destroyed. He had a mission about creating something wonderful. He also had exactly 38 days to make real for 24 orphaned children from across the galaxy. The clock was ticking, and had never been so excited about an impossible de-spent the next 3 days buried in logistics planning with an intensity that reminded him why he'd been promoted ahead of his peers. His quarters had transformed into a command center, with holographic displays showing shipping schedules, personnel rotations, and supply manifests floating above every available surface. What he discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. Making Christmas real for 24 children would require the coordination of resources across half the galaxy. The breakthrough came when he realized he was thinking too small. Instead of trying to work within the limited resources of station, he needed to think like the military strategist he'd been trained to be. The station wasn't just an isolated outpost. It was a hub in a vast network of supply lines, personnel transfers, and information exchange that stretched across human space and beyond. His first recruit was Corporal Lisa Santos, a communications specialist who'd been fighting boredom during her rotation on the station. Found her in the comm center during the night shift, monitoring routine traffic between merchant vessels and military transports. I need someone who can coordinate complex communications across multiple channels without leaving any official records, he said without preamble. Lisa looked up from her displays, her dark eyes immediately alert. That sounds either highly illegal or highly entertaining. Please tell me it's both. It's Christmas, said simply. Christmas? Lisa blinked in confusion. Sarge, it's November, and this is a military station. We don't do Christmas. I pulled up a holographic display showing the residential wing's floor plan. 24 refugee children who lost everything think isn't real because adults have stopped believing in impossible things. I'm going to prove them wrong. Lisa stared at the display, then back at the display. You're serious? Completely. You realize that half those kids aren't even human, is a human mythology. Which is why this is going to be the most inclusive Christmas celebration in galactic history. Pulled up another display showing his research into alien holiday traditions. Every species has gift-giving celebrations. Every culture has stories about hope coming from unexpected places. We're not just going to give them human Christmas. We're going to give them the Christmas that proves all their stories were true. Lisa was quiet for a moment, her fingers absently adjusting communication frequencies as she thought. What do you need? I need to coordinate with ships passing through this sector without using official channels. I need to arrange for supplies to be delivered without going through normal requisition procedures. And I need to do all of this while making it look like routine administrative traffic. A slow smile spread across Lisa's face. You know what, Sarge? I've been monitoring routine cargo transfers for 6 months. It's about time something interesting came through my comm board. Their next recruit was Chief Petty Officer, whom they found in the station's workshop at 300 hours, building what appeared to be a miniature starship engine out of spare parts. Chief said, how do you feel about making toys? Looked up from his work, his weathered face creasing into a grin. Depends. Are we talking regulation toys or the kind that actually do something interesting? Well, we're talking about toys that convince children from a dozen different species that magic is real. Now that, said, setting down his tools, sounds like my kind of engineering problem. Within a week, had assembled what he privately thought of as the most unusual special operations team in military history. There was Santos handling communications, managing fabrication and logistics, and a growing network of volunteers from across the station who'd heard whispers about Christmas project and wanted in. Dr. Harrison from the medical bay volunteered her expertise in xenobiology, pointing out that different species had vastly different sensory experiences. If you really want this to feel magical, she explained, you need to think about how it experiences color versus how an Avalon processes sound. What seems amazing to a human might be completely ordinary to a Ensign David from the quartermaster's office provided access to supply manifests and shipping schedules. There are merchant vessels passing through here every day carrying goods for civilian colonies, he told over coffee in the station's mess hall. Most of them have extra cargo space, and their captains are always looking for ways to earn goodwill with military stations. The plan that emerged was elegantly complex. Rather than trying to create everything on station, they would coordinate with dozens of ships, stations, and outposts across the sector to create the appearance of a Christmas miracle that had arrived from across the galaxy. The first test came when the merchant vessel, Stellar Dawn, arrived carrying routine supplies for the outer colonies. Captain was a gruff woman in her 50s who'd been running cargo between military outposts for decades. But her eyes lit up when explained what they were trying to accomplish. You want me to carry what to wear? She asked, studying the list had given her. Toys and gifts from Avalon space to make it look like they came from the Crystal Singers. Traditional feast foods to show that someone remembered their Starbringer festivals. Flame gems that are practically impossible to get in this sector. Leaned forward intently. But all of it has to arrive looking like it came from the children's home worlds, not like it was purchased from commercial suppliers. A captain was quiet for a long moment. You realize this is going to cost more than my profit margin for this entire run. I know. That's why I'm prepared to cover the costs out of my own pay, plus hazard bonuses for everyone involved. Kid said with a laugh, keep your money. I've got scattered across 3 systems, and the idea of making Christmas real for refugee kids. She stood up and extended her hand. You've got yourself a logistics partner. Within 2 weeks, had a network of merchant captains, station commanders, and even a few sympathetic prisoners of war who were willing to help create the most elaborate Christmas deception in galactic history. Messages flowed through unofficial channels, using Santos's expertise to make them look like routine commercial traffic. Supplies began accumulating in hidden storage compartments throughout the station. But the real breakthrough came when realized he was still thinking too small. He was reviewing the children's files in his quarters when the pattern hit him. These weren't just random orphans who'd ended up on station by chance. Each of these children represented families, communities, and worlds that had been destroyed by the expansion. Their presence here was a testament to loss, but it was also something else. It was a map. I pulled up a galactic chart, marking the home worlds of each child in the residential wing. What he saw made his breath catch. These children came from 15 different systems that formed a rough circle around the edge of known space, the exact region where the hegemony had been testing their expansion strategies. But more importantly, most of these worlds had been evacuated, not destroyed, which meant there were refugee populations scattered throughout human space, populations that included extended families, community leaders, and cultural experts from each of these civilizations. Santos said, activating his comm unit. I need you to run a search through refugee databases for anyone who came from the same worlds as our kids. Well, what kind of search? Lisa's voice came back immediately. She'd been pulling extra shifts to coordinate their growing network of Christmas conspirators. I want to find their people, not their families. Most of those are gone, but people from their cultures who might still remember what their holidays were supposed to look like. 3 days later, Santos called him to the comm center with an expression of barely contained excitement. Sarge, you need to see this. The main display showed a list of names, locations, and contact information. I found them, Santos said. Not just a few. I found representatives from every single culture in Residential Wing 7. There's a storyteller on the agricultural station at 7. An Avalon crystal singer working as an engineer on the mining platform at Wolf 359. A whole community of craftspeople who escaped to the industrial complex at Tau. I felt his heart racing as he scanned the list. How many of them? Over 300 people scattered across 24 stations and colonies within communication range. And here's the beautiful part. They all want to help. When I explained what we were trying to do, every single one of them volunteered to contribute something to make Christmas real for these kids. The project transformed overnight from an elaborate deception into something that was beginning to realize might actually be magical. The storyteller on Seven began recording traditional Starbringer tales in the ancient dialect that Little would remember from his childhood. The Avalon Crystal Singer composed a song that incorporated harmonic frequencies that would resonate with unique crystalline physiology. Most remarkably, the craftspeople at Tau began working around the clock to create a set of traditional flame gems. Not the synthetic versions that were commercially available, but actual pieces of their crystal formations that had been carried into exile and carefully preserved. This is getting bigger than I expected, told Colonel Martinez during one of their weekly check-ins. It's not just about making Christmas for these kids anymore. It's turned into a galaxy-wide effort to prove that their cultures survived, that their traditions matter, that they're not forgotten. Martinez looked at the reports had compiled, her expression thoughtful. How many people are involved now? Directly, about 50 personnel across a dozen stations. Indirectly, paused doing quick calculations. Probably close to 1,000 people across human space and allied territories. 1,000 people working together to give 24 children Christmas. Martinez shook her head. Do you realize what you've created here? Ma'am, you've created the kind of operation that wins wars, not through firepower or strategy, but by reminding people what they're fighting for. She stood up, moving to the viewport that looked out over the docking bays where merchant vessels came and went in a steady stream. Half of those ships are carrying something for your Christmas project. Personnel are volunteering for extra shifts to help with fabrication and coordination. Station morale is the highest it's been since I took command. I felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the station's climate control. Does that mean you approve? At this point, I'm not sure I could stop this if I wanted to. You've turned Christmas into a military operation with voluntary enlistment across 24 star systems. She turned back to face him and was surprised to see tears in her eyes. But more than that, you've reminded all of us that we're not just fighting against something. We're fighting for something. For the idea that children deserve to believe in wonder, that cultures deserve to be preserved, that hope is worth whatever effort it takes to make it real. As left the colonel's office, he realized that the project had grown beyond anything he'd originally imagined. In trying to make real for 24 refugee children, he'd accidentally created the largest interspecies cooperation effort in recent galactic history. Humans, Avalons, and even a few sympathetic ex-prisoners were working together to create something that none of them could have achieved alone. But there was still one piece missing, one element that would transform their elaborate coordination into something truly magical. Checked the calendar on his personal tablet. 18 days until Christmas, and he still hadn't figured out how to make himself appear. That was when Corporal Santos appeared at his door with an expression that could only be described as mischievous. Corporal Santos led through the station's lower levels, past maintenance bays and storage compartments he'd never seen before. The corridors here were narrower, older, part of the original construction that had been built when Station was first established as a frontier outpost. Santos, where exactly are we going? Asked as they descended another level via a maintenance lift that seemed to groan under their weight. Level C7, Section 12. The old observation deck that got sealed off when they expanded the docking bays. Santos's eyes held the same gleam they got when she was coordinating particularly complex communications arrays. There's something down there you need to see. They emerged into a corridor that felt different from the rest of the station. The walls here were older, with viewing ports that looked out into space, instead of the internal courtyards and docking areas that dominated the upper levels. Emergency lighting cast everything in a dim blue glow that made their footsteps sound unnaturally loud. "Here," Santos said, stopping in front of a door marked with warnings about atmospheric seals and emergency protocols. She input a code on the access panel and raised an eyebrow. How do you have access to sealed sections?" "Comm specialists have access to everything, Sarge. How do you think we troubleshoot network issues?" The door slid open with a hiss of equalizing pressure. "Besides, this section isn't really sealed. It's just forgotten." They followed her through the doorway and immediately understood why this area had been abandoned. They were standing in what must have been a magnificent observation lounge when the station was first built, with floor-to-ceiling transparent aluminum windows that provided a panoramic view of space. But the expansion of the docking bays had blocked most of the view, leaving only a narrow slice of visible between massive structural supports. "It's impressive," said, "but I don't see how this helps us with—" Over here," Santos interrupted, leading him toward the far end of the lounge. Stopped short when he saw what she was pointing at. Sitting in a massive, ornate chair that must have been part of the lounge's original furnishing was a figure that made blink twice to make sure he was seeing correctly. The man was enormous, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that filled the chair completely. His hair was white as starlight, and his beard flowed down to his chest, neatly trimmed but undeniably magnificent. He wore simple gray station coveralls, but the way he sat in that chair made it look like a throne. Most remarkably, his eyes held a warmth and intelligence that reminded of every grandfather figure from every story he'd ever heard as a child. "Sergeant," the man said in a voice that seemed to resonate from somewhere deep in his chest, "Corporal Santos tells me you've been looking for—" He found himself momentarily speechless. The man before him looked like he'd stepped out of a children's book, but there was nothing childish about his presence. He radiated the kind of calm authority that had only seen in the most experienced senior officers. "Sir," managed, "I'm sorry, but I don't think we've been introduced." The man laughed, a sound that filled the empty lounge with unexpected warmth. "Chief Warrant Officer, Station Engineering Corps, but most folks just call me Nick." He gestured to a pair of chairs near his own. "Please sit. Santos has been telling me about your Christmas project." And Santos took the offered seats and found himself studying the man more carefully. Now that he was closer, he could see that was older than he'd first appeared, probably in his 60s, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades in space. His hands were massive but gentle, and there was something about his presence that made feel like he was sitting with someone who'd seen everything the galaxy had to offer and somehow managed to maintain an unshakable faith in the goodness of people. "Chief," began carefully, "what exactly did Santos tell you?" That you're trying to make Christmas real for a bunch of refugee kids who lost everything." His eyes twinkled in a way that was almost unsettling. "That you've got half the sector coordinating supplies and gifts. That you've turned what started as one man's mission into the biggest interspecies cooperation effort since the formation of the Galactic Alliance. He leaned forward slightly. But that you haven't figured out how to make the magic visible to the children. They felt his heart skip. You think you can help with that? The son said with another of those resonant laughs. I've been working station engineering for 37 years. I've maintained life support systems, gravity generators, atmospheric processors, and structural integrity fields across more stations than you've probably visited. And in all that time, I've learned one very important truth about technology. Which is any sufficiently advanced engineering is indistinguishable from magic. His eyes held a gleam that reminded uncomfortably of the expression Santos got when she was planning something elaborate. The question isn't whether we can make appear for those children. The question is whether we can make his appearance spectacular enough that they'll remember it for the rest of their lives. Santos pulled up a holographic display from her portable unit, showing the layout of the residential wing. Nick's been studying the station's internal systems, Sarge. He says there are things we can do with atmospheric processors, artificial gravity, even the lighting systems that could make Christmas morning look like, well, like magic. Nodded thoughtfully. The residential wing has independent climate control, right? So we can adjust temperature, humidity, even introduce harmless atmospheric effects. The gravity generators can be fine-tuned to create localized variations. Not enough to be dangerous, but enough to make objects seem to float or move in unusual ways. You're talking about creating special effects, said slowly. I'm talking about creating an environment where impossible things become possible, corrected. Where gifts appear overnight in ways that can't be explained by normal logistics. Where the air itself seems to shimmer with possibility. Where children from a dozen different species all experience something that resonates with their deepest cultural memories of wonder. I felt his pulse quickening. Can you really do that? Son, I once kept a space station operational for 3 months using duct tape, prayer, and creative interpretation of the laws of physics. Making appear is just another engineering problem. Stood up, his massive frame making the oversized chair look suddenly normal-sized. But I'll need complete access to the residential wing systems, and I'll need about 2 weeks to set everything up. That only gives us 4 days after your preparations are complete, Santos pointed out. 4 days to test everything and make sure it works perfectly, agreed. Because if we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. He looked at with an expression that was suddenly serious. You understand what you're really trying to accomplish here, don't you? The thought about the children in residential wing 7, about's bitter certainty that adults had stopped believing in good things, about little scales shifting to sad colors when he talked about missing his family's celebrations. I'm trying to prove that hope isn't foolish, that wonder isn't weakness, that even in the middle of a war, good things can still happen if people are willing to work for them. They smiled, and for a moment could have sworn the man's eyes actually twinkled. Then we understand each other perfectly. He turned to Santos. Corporal, I'll need detailed schematics of the residential wing's environmental systems. Also, I want to know the exact species and physiological requirements for each child. Already prepared, Santos said, producing a data tablet. Along with cultural research on each species' traditional holiday celebrations and sensory preferences. Excellent. Took the tablet and began scrolling through the information. Children respond to subsonic frequencies that remind them of their geological activity, experience color differently than humans, seeing well into the infrared spectrum. Avalon children have crystalline nervous systems that resonate with specific electromagnetic frequencies. We watched as absorbed the information with the focused intensity of a master engineer studying a complex problem. You really think you can create something that will feel magical to all of them? I think, said without looking up from the tablet, that I can create something that will redefine their understanding of what's possible. He finally looked up, meeting eyes directly. But there's one more thing you need to understand about this operation. What's that? If we do this right, if we really make Christmas magical for these children, we won't just be giving them a holiday celebration. We'll be giving them proof that the universe hasn't forgotten about them, that their cultures matter, that someone somewhere cares enough to move heaven and earth to make them happy. His expression became even more serious. That's a powerful gift, son, and it comes with responsibility. I felt the weight of those words settling on his shoulders. What kind of responsibility? The responsibility to make sure this isn't just a one-time event. These children will remember this Christmas for the rest of their lives. It will become part of their story, part of how they understand what's possible in the universe. Set the tablet aside and fixed with a stare that seemed to see right through him. So you'd better be prepared to follow through. Because once you convince a child that magic is real, you'd better be ready to keep making magic happen. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the commitment they were making settling around them like a physical presence. Outside the observation windows, stars wheeled slowly past as the station continued its eternal orbit, and found himself thinking about all the people across the galaxy who were already contributing to this project. There's something else," Santos said quietly. "Something I discovered when I was coordinating with the refugee communities." I turned to look at her. "What?" "This isn't the only group of refugee children. There are dozens of them scattered across human space and allied territories. Kids who lost everything, who've been told that their old ways don't matter anymore, that they need to adapt and forget about the past." Her voice carried an intensity that had never heard from her before. "What if this Christmas project isn't just about our 24 children? What if it's a prototype for something bigger?" His eyes lit up with understanding. "You're talking about creating a network, a way to coordinate Christmas celebrations across multiple stations and colonies." "I'm talking about proving that hope is contagious," Santos replied. "That when people see impossible things happening for good reasons, they start believing that impossible things can happen for them too." They felt something shifting in his chest, the same feeling he'd had when he first realized that this project was bigger than just one Christmas celebration. "You're suggesting we turn this into an ongoing operation?" "I'm suggesting," Santos said with a smile that reminded why communication specialists were sometimes the most dangerous people on a station, "that we turn into a permanent military position." The idea hung in the air between them, simultaneously absurd and brilliant. Found himself thinking about Colonel Martinez's words about operations that win wars not through firepower, but by reminding people what they're fighting for. "It would require permanent funding," he said slowly, thinking out loud. "Dedicated personnel across multiple sectors, coordination with civilian authorities and refugee resettlement programs." It would require someone willing to take responsibility for making sure that Christmas happens for children who have no other reason to believe in good things, added quietly. Someone who understands that hope is a strategic resource worth fighting for. Looked at the two of them, Santos with her communication networks that could reach across the galaxy, with his engineering expertise that could make impossible things seem routine, and realized that they weren't just talking about Christmas anymore. They were talking about creating an institution, a permanent reminder that wonder and joy were worth preserving even in the middle of a war. The first step, he said finally, is to make Christmas work for our children, to prove that it can be done. Agreed, said, standing up. So let's get to work. We have 2 weeks to turn the residential wing into the most magical place in the galaxy. As they made their way back through the forgotten corridors toward the active sections of the station, felt the weight of what they were attempting settling on his shoulders like a command responsibility. They weren't just trying to give 24 children a happy holiday. They were trying to prove that hope could be engineered, that wonder could be systematically created, that Christmas was too important to leave to chance. The transformation of Residential Wing 7 began at 400 hours on December 15th, when Chief and a team of volunteer engineers began what they publicly called routine environmental system maintenance. Watched from the security checkpoint as they wheeled in equipment that looked far too sophisticated for basic atmospheric adjustments. Field generators? Asked, reading the labels on one of the larger devices. For precise control of localized gravity fields, explained, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who could make the impossible sound routine. We'll be able to create pockets where objects float, where snow falls upward, where gifts seem to appear from thin air. And this gestured to what looked like a complex holographic projection system. Environmental imaging array. It'll allow us to create visual effects that respond to each child's specific optical range. What looks like gentle starlight to a human will appear as warm flame patterns to a, while an Avalon child will see crystal formations that sing in harmony with their nervous system. They felt a mixture of awe and terror as he watched the engineers work. Over the past 2 weeks, their Christmas conspiracy had grown to involve over 1,200 people across 37 different stations, colonies and ships. The logistics alone were staggering, coordinating deliveries, timing arrivals, ensuring that everything appeared at exactly the right moment without leaving any trace of how it had actually happened. But watching's team install what amounted to a miracle generation system made realize they were crossing a line between elaborate planning and something that might genuinely qualify as magic. Chief, he said quietly, are you sure this is safe? We're talking about children from multiple species with different physiological requirements. Looked up from a device that was measuring electromagnetic field fluctuations. Son, I've been maintaining life support systems for 3 decades. I know more about keeping different species healthy and comfortable than most. His expression became serious. Everything we're installing has been tested and certified safe for all known sentient species. The effects will be spectacular, but harmless. But will they believe it? That, said with one of his mysterious smiles, depends on how well we understand what magic really is. The answer to that question came 3 days later when Lyra requested an emergency meeting with. He found her in the small office adjacent to the residential wing's main common area, her usually calm demeanor clearly strained. Sergeant, she said without preamble, something unusual is happening with the children. They felt his heart skip. What kind of unusual? They're hopeful. Lyra pulled up a series of reports on her personal tablet. For the past week, they've been talking about Christmas constantly. Not the bitter, resigned way they were before, but with genuine excitement. They're making lists of things they want, planning celebrations, even teaching each other about their different cultural traditions. And tried to keep his expression neutral. That sounds positive. It is positive. That's what worries me. Lyra set the tablet aside and looked at directly. These children have learned to protect themselves by not expecting good things to happen. Suddenly, they're all convinced that this Christmas is going to be special. What happens to them when Christmas morning comes and it's just another day in a refugee facility? The question hit like a punch to the gut. For all his planning and preparation, he'd been so focused on creating a perfect Christmas that he hadn't fully considered what would happen if something went wrong. If the equipment malfunctioned, if supplies didn't arrive on schedule, if any of the 1,000 moving pieces of their operation failed at the critical moment. Lyra, he said carefully, what if I told you that their hope might not be misplaced? I'd say that's exactly the kind of thinking that leads to children getting their hearts broken. Her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd been protecting vulnerable children from disappointment for too long. Sergeant, I appreciate whatever you're trying to do, but these children have been through enough trauma. They don't need the additional pain of believing in something that isn't real. He found himself in an impossible position. He couldn't reveal the details of their operation without risking security. But he also couldn't stand by and watch Lyra try to prepare the children for disappointment that wasn't going to come. Well, what if, he said slowly, you trusted them to know something you don't? Lyra stared at him for a long moment. What do you mean? I've been watching these children for weeks now. They've survived things that would break most adults. They've learned to read people, to understand when adults are lying to them or trying to protect them from harsh realities. Leaned forward. What if their sudden hope isn't naive optimism? What if they're picking up on cues that something really is different this time? Cues from where? The thought about the dozens of station personnel who were now involved in their Christmas conspiracy, about the barely contained excitement that seemed to be spreading through the entire station as December 25th approached. Have you noticed that station personnel have been acting differently lately? More cheerful, more optimistic. Lyra paused, clearly thinking. Actually, yes. Even the usually grumpy maintenance staff have been unusually pleasant. I assumed it was just normal holiday spirit. Maybe it is, but maybe it's the kind of holiday spirit that comes from people working together on something wonderful. Chose his words carefully. What if, instead of trying to protect these children from disappointment, you helped them prepare for something amazing? Sergeant, are you telling me that you've arranged something special for Christmas? Met her eyes directly. I'm telling you that these children matter to more people than you realize, and that sometimes, when enough people work together toward the same goal, impossible things become possible. Lyra was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with the careful attention of someone trained to read the emotional states of traumatized children. You really believe that, don't you? I believe that hope is too important to leave to chance. And I believe that these children deserve to know that the galaxy hasn't forgotten about them. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the common area. Through the office window, they could see the children gathered around Little, the Avalon girl, who was holding something that glittered in the artificial light. What does she have?" Lyra asked, moving toward the door. They followed her into the common area, where the children were passing around what appeared to be a piece of crystalline material that sang softly when touched. It was beautiful, intricate, and completely impossible. There was no way for an Avalon crystal song stone to exist on station. "Well, where did you find this?" Lyra asked gently. "It was under my pillow when I woke up," said, her crystalline features reflecting the stone's light in patterns that made her look like she was glowing from within. "It sings the harmony my grandmother used to make when I was little." They felt his breath catch. The refugee communities they'd contacted hadn't been scheduled to send anything for another week. But as he looked at the stone more closely, he could see that it wasn't just any Avalon crystal. The patterns carved into its surface were specific to family lineage, a piece of her that someone had preserved and sent across the galaxy to reach her. "It's beautiful," Lyra said softly, and could hear the wonder in her voice. "But how?" "Maybe," said the human girl who'd been so bitter about adult disbelief. "Maybe someone is listening after all." The other children crowded closer and watched as Little's scales shifted to bright gold, the color that indicated pure joy among his people. "If got something from home," he said excitedly, "maybe we'll all get something." "Now, children," Lyra began automatically, "we shouldn't assume." "Well, why not?" interrupted the young, whose scales had shifted to the bronze color that indicated philosophical contemplation. "Maybe assuming good things is better than assuming bad things. Maybe hope is a choice we get to make." He found himself staring at the 9-year-old who just articulated something that had taken him 35 years to learn. Around the circle, children from a dozen different species were nodding agreement, their various physiological responses all indicating the same thing. These children had decided to believe in possibility. Lyra said quietly, "I think they're teaching us something." She looked at him with an expression that was part confusion and part recognition. What? That sometimes magic starts with choosing to believe in it. That night found himself back in the forgotten observation lounge with and Santos. But this time they weren't alone. Word had somehow spread about their makeshift headquarters, and nearly 24 station personnel had joined them for what had become an informal mission briefing. The Avalon crystal wasn't supposed to arrive until next week, Dr. Harrison was saying, consulting her medical tablet. How did it get to Sroom? I may have expedited that particular delivery, Santos admitted with a slight smile. When I realized how much the children needed a sign that something was really happening, I contacted the Avalon engineers and asked if they could transmit the crystal patterns to our fabrication unit. You had our fabricators reproduce an Avalon family crystal. Looked impressed despite himself. That's incredibly complex work. It gets better, Santos continued. They didn't just send the patterns. They coordinated with the 3 other Avalon refugees in this sector to infuse the crystal with harmonic frequencies that carry actual memories from grandmother. What she's holding isn't just a replica. It's a piece of her family's music preserved in crystal form. They felt a chill run down his spine. Santos, are you telling me we've just created technology that can store and transmit memories across species? I'm telling you that when you get enough people working together on making impossible things happen, you sometimes discover that impossible was just another word for no one has tried hard enough yet. Santos gestured to the holographic displays that now covered most of the lounge's surfaces. Look at what we've accomplished in 3 weeks. The displays showed the full scope of their operation. Supply chains that stretched across half the galaxy. Coordination between military and civilian personnel that transcended normal command structures, and technological innovations that were being developed in real time to solve specific problems related to interspecies gift giving. We've created a logistics network that can deliver culturally appropriate, personally meaningful gifts to refugee children regardless of their location in known space, added. We've developed environmental control systems that can create customized sensory experiences for multiple species simultaneously. We've established communication protocols that allow real-time coordination between military stations, civilian colonies, and merchant vessels. And we've done all of this, Dr. Harrison said quietly, because we decided that making 24 children happy was worth whatever effort it took. The weight of that statement settled over the group like a warm blanket. Looked around at the faces of his fellow conspirators, engineers, medics, communications specialists, supply officers, and maintenance technicians who'd all volunteered their expertise to make Christmas real. There's something else, he said slowly. Something I realized when I saw with that crystal. What? Santos asked. We're not just making Christmas for these children. We're proving that cooperation works. That people from different backgrounds, different specialties, different worlds can work together to create something none of them could achieve alone. Gestured to the displays showing their network of collaborators. This operation involves humans, Avalons, and even reformed working together toward a common goal. When was the last time that happened outside of a military emergency? His eyes held that familiar twinkle. You're realizing that Christmas might be more than just a holiday celebration. I'm realizing that Christmas might be a model for how the galaxy could work if people decided that making each other happy was as important as making each other profitable or making each other dead. The observation lounge was quiet for a moment as everyone absorbed the implications of what had said. They'd started with the simple goal of making real for 24 refugee children. They'd accidentally created a proof of concept for galactic civilization based on cooperation and generosity rather than competition and resource scarcity. So, Santos said finally, what do we do with that knowledge? First, said, we make this Christmas absolutely perfect. We prove that this kind of cooperation can create real magic, real wonder, real hope. And then Dr. Harrison asked. I smiled, feeling the same certainty he'd experienced when he'd first decided to make real. Then we figure out how to make it permanent. Outside the observation windows, stars wheeled past in their eternal dance. And somewhere December 25th arrived on station with the quiet efficiency of orbital mechanics. No fanfare, no special announcements, just another rotation in the station's eternal dance around the system's primary star. But at 5:30 hours, in the residential wing where 24 refugee children slept in beds that had been provided by military surplus, something unprecedented began to happen. It started with the air itself. The Avalon girl woke first as her crystalline nervous system responded to electromagnetic frequencies that resonated with half-remembered lullabies from her. The atmosphere in the residential wing had shifted overnight, carrying harmonics that spoke to the deepest parts of her genetic memory. As she sat up in bed, the air around her began to shimmer with patterns of light that her unique physiology could perceive as music made visible. In the next bed, little stirred as subsonic vibrations mimicked the geological rhythms of during the Starbringer season. His scales shifted from sleek gray to the deep gold of pure joy, as his dormant instincts recognized the planetary harmonics that had been engineered into the station's environmental systems. One by one, the children awakened to an environment that had been precisely calibrated to feel like the magical celebrations of their lost worlds. The boy opened his eyes to see patterns of infrared light dancing across the ceiling in the ritual flame patterns that his ancestors had used to welcome the season of remembrance. The human children found themselves breathing air that carried the faint scent of pine forests and winter snow, impossible smells that triggered memories of Earth Christmases they'd never actually experienced, but somehow felt in their bones. The bitter human girl who'd proclaimed that adults had stopped believing in good things was the last to wake. She opened her eyes to find the common room transformed into something that every law of physics she thought she understood. Snow was falling upward from the floor, each flake catching the light and dissolving into sparkles before it reached the ceiling. Gifts wrapped in materials that seemed to shift color with each heartbeat were arranged under a tree that appeared to be growing from the station's metal floor, its branches reaching toward stars that were somehow visible through what should have been solid bulkheads. "It's impossible," she whispered, but her voice held wonder instead of skepticism. Lyra entered the common room at exactly 600 hours, following the schedule she'd maintained for 3 years of caring for refugee children. But she stopped short at the threshold, her breath catching as she took in a scene that challenged everything she thought she knew about the limitations of space station environments. The children were gathered in a loose circle around the impossible tree, but they weren't frantically tearing into gifts or demanding explanations for the miraculous transformation of their living space. Instead, they sat in quiet amazement, watching the gentle dance of upward falling snow and listening to harmonics that somehow incorporated the traditional celebration songs of a dozen different worlds. How Lyra breathed, looking around for some explanation of the technology that could create such comprehensive sensory magic. Someone listened, said simply, her crystalline features reflecting the tree's light in patterns that made her look like a living constellation. Someone remembered that we matter. Before Lyra could respond, a figure stepped out from behind the impossible tree. He was tall and broad, with white hair and a magnificent beard, wearing simple gray coveralls that somehow looked as regal as any costume. His eyes held the kind of warmth that made every child feel like they were the most important person in the galaxy. "Ho, ho, ho," Chief said in his resonant voice, and somehow the traditional greeting carried harmonics that each species could interpret as the celebratory call of their own culture. "I hope you've all been good this year." The children stared at him for a moment, and who was watching from a carefully concealed observation post, held his breath. This was the crucial moment when all their planning would either create genuine magic or reveal itself as an elaborate technological trick. Little was the first to move, his scales shifting through a rainbow of colors that indicated cascading emotional responses. "You're really him," he said in wonder. "You're really the one who brings light across the darkness." "I'm really someone who believes that children deserve to know they're not forgotten," replied gently. "Would you like to see what friends from across the galaxy sent for you?" What followed was unlike any gift-opening ceremony in galactic history. Each present had been crafted specifically for its recipient, not just as an object, but as a message. The children received story crystals that held the voices of tribal elders from the refugee camps, telling traditional tales that preserved their culture for the next generation. The boy found flame gems that carried the actual mineral signatures of his, allowing him to hold pieces of the planet where his ancestors had lived for thousands of years. But it was gift that made understand the full scope of what they'd accomplished. She unwrapped a simple book, paper pages bound in honest leather, nothing technological or exotic about it. But as she opened the cover and began to read, her eyes widened with recognition. These are the stories," she said quietly. "The ones Mama used to tell me before the raids came, but how? Mama's gone. The ship records were destroyed." He knelt beside her with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to comforting children. "Your mother told those stories to other mothers, who told them to their children, who grew up to tell them to their children. Stories don't die just because the people who first told them are gone. They live in everyone who ever heard them and chose to remember." Watched through his concealed viewpoint as burst into tears, not the bitter sobs of loss, but the cleansing release of someone who just discovered that pieces of their world had survived after all. Around the room, similar revelations were unfolding as each child discovered that their gifts weren't just objects, but connections to their cultures, their families, their sense of belonging in a galaxy that had seemed determined to erase their identities. This is magic," whispered the young, holding his flame gems up to catch the impossible light from the tree. "Real magic." "No," said gently. "This is what happens when people decide that making each other happy is more important than protecting themselves from disappointment. Magic doesn't come from mysterious forces. It comes from ordinary people choosing to do extraordinary things for each other." As the morning progressed, the children discovered that their Christmas celebration extended far beyond the gifts under the tree. Throughout the residential wing, environmental systems continued to create wonders that responded to each species' unique sensory capabilities. Meals appeared in the dining area that incorporated traditional celebration foods from every represented culture, prepared according to recipes that had been transmitted across the galaxy by refugee communities who'd wanted to contribute to the miracle. But the most remarkable discovery came when approached the transparent aluminum viewport that looked out into space. Instead of the usual view of stars and passing ships, the window now showed a real-time communication link to dozens of other locations across the galaxy. Refugee children on other stations were celebrating their own Christmas mornings, their faces bright with the same wonder and joy that filled Residential Wing 7. "It's not just us," breathed her crystalline features lighting up with understanding. "It's everywhere. Christmas is happening everywhere." He felt tears streaming down his face as he watched the children discover that they were part of something vast and wonderful. A network of celebration and care that stretched across star systems and species boundaries. His small project to make real for 24 orphaned children had grown into something that connected refugee communities across the galaxy, proving that hope was indeed contagious, and that cooperation could create wonders that no individual could achieve alone. "Sergeant," a familiar voice said behind him. I turned to find Colonel Martinez standing in the observation alcove, her expression mixing awe with something that might have been pride. A colonel said, quickly wiping his eyes, "I was just... You were just watching the most successful military operation I've ever seen," Martinez interrupted quietly. "Do you realize what you've accomplished here?" He looked back through the viewport at the children, who were now teaching each other the celebration songs of their different cultures, while impossible snow continued to fall upward around them. "We gave them Christmas. You gave them proof that the galaxy cares about them. You created a cooperation network that involves thousands of people across dozens of systems. You demonstrated that human ingenuity, when focused on making others happy rather than defeating enemies, can create literal miracles." Martinez moved to stand beside him at the viewport. "And you did it all because you refused to accept that good things weren't possible." As they watched, Chief gathered the children around him and began telling them about the people who'd worked to make their Christmas real. The engineers who designed the environmental effects, the refugee communities who'd shared their cultural traditions, the ship captains who'd carried gifts across impossible distances, the hundreds of military and civilian personnel who'd volunteered their time and expertise. He's teaching them that they're part of something bigger, realized. He's teaching them that they have the power to make magic for other people, Martinez corrected. "Look at their faces. They're not just receiving gifts anymore. They're understanding that they can be gift givers too." She was right. The children's expressions had shifted from wonder at receiving to excitement about participating. They were already talking about how they could help make Christmas happen for other refugee children, how they could contribute their own skills and knowledge to the growing network of celebration and care. Martinez said quietly, "I've been thinking about your suggestion that we make a permanent military position." I felt his heart skip. "Colonel..." The Pentagon has been looking for ways to improve civilian relations and demonstrate that human military forces are about protection and cooperation, not just destruction. What you've created here, this network of interspecies collaboration focused on civilian welfare, it's exactly the kind of program that could change how the galaxy sees humanity. She turned to face him directly. How would you feel about a promotion to lieutenant colonel and command of a new division focused on humanitarian coordination? I stared at her, the magnitude of the offer slowly sinking in. You're serious? Dead serious. The Christmas Division, officially designated as humanitarian coordination and morale support, with permanent funding, dedicated personnel, and authority to coordinate with civilian refugee services across human space and allied territories. Martinez smiled. Your job would be making sure that no refugee child anywhere in the galaxy ever has to doubt that someone cares about them. Through the viewport, watched as the bitter girl who'd proclaimed that adults had stopped believing in good things carefully explained to a younger child how the upward falling snow worked, her face bright with the joy of sharing wonder instead of protecting against disappointment. When do I start? He asked. Colonel Martinez laughed, a sound that carried the same warmth that had filled ho, ho, ho earlier that morning. Son, you started the day you decided that needed to be real. Everything else is just paperwork. As Christmas Day continued on station, the children in Residential Wing 7 discovered that their celebration was just the beginning. Messages began arriving from across the galaxy. Thank you notes from other refugee communities, offers of cooperation from civilian organizations, requests from military stations asking how they could implement similar programs for their own refugee populations. The Christmas conspiracy that had started with one soldier's refusal to accept that good things weren't possible had become a movement that was spreading faster than the most efficient communication networks. Hope, it turned out, was indeed contagious. That evening, as the artificial day cycle dimmed to simulate sunset, found himself back in the forgotten observation lounge with his original conspirators. But the room was no longer empty and overlooked. It had been designated as the official headquarters of the Humanitarian Coordination Division, and the massive chair where had first appeared was now recognized as the official seat of the position that would forever be known throughout human space as. So, Corporal Santos said, studying the reports that continued streaming in from across the galaxy. What do we do for an encore? Easter, Dr. Harrison suggested with a completely straight face. There are probably children who need to believe in resurrection and renewal. Halloween countered. Kids who've been through trauma need to know that scary things can be fun instead of threatening. All of them, Chief said quietly from his throne-like chair. Every celebration that reminds children that the universe has room for joy, wonder, and hope. Every tradition that proves that people are capable of creating beauty in the middle of darkness. Looked around at his team, the people who'd helped him turn an impossible idea into a galaxy-changing reality, and realized that they'd discovered something more profound than just how to make Christmas real. They discovered that magic wasn't about violating the laws of physics. It was about understanding the laws of human nature well enough to create conditions where the impossible became inevitable. They'd learned that hope wasn't naive optimism. It was a strategic choice that could be systematically implemented through careful planning, dedicated resources, and the stubborn refusal to accept that good things weren't worth fighting for. Most importantly, they'd proven that the phrase "isn't real" was only true if you didn't have the courage and imagination to make him real. Outside the observation windows, stars continued their eternal dance across the void, and among them, ships were already carrying news of stations' Christmas miracle to distant worlds, where other children waited to discover whether the universe cared about them. The answer, now knew with absolute certainty, was always going to be yes. Because somewhere in the galaxy, there were people who decided that making real was more important than accepting that he wasn't. And as long as such people existed, magic would continue to happen, one impossible Christmas at a time. Them supply ships were converging on station, carrying the dreams of 1,000 volunteers who decided that making children happy was worth moving heaven and earth. Christmas was still 8 days away, but was beginning to suspect that the real miracle had already begun. And if they succeeded, they might just change how the galaxy thought about the relationship between magic and reality. Sarge, she said, I think I know how to make the big guy real, but you're not going to believe where I found him. In his life,